If you could spend a moment with some remarkable people and discover what their life sounds like, what would you ask? Welcome to Are We On Air? An audio encounter. I'm Armand Nafei, and each episode will feature one conversation with an inspiring friend of mine who will share with us the soundtrack to their life. Marhaba Habibis, and welcome to another wonderful episode of Are We On Air? This week's guest is the global music aficionado, hailing all the way from Cologne, Germany. Who knew? JANNIS STÜRTZ, aka HABIBI FUNK. JANNIS and I got together a good year ago in Berlin at our friend's hotel, the Chateau Royal, to go digging into what the music label HABIBI FUNK is, where it came from, where it is heading, and where it finds some of the rarest goodies out there. In his terms, what we re-release is largely overlooked special interest music. Music that absorbed influences from various areas and became something new. They have released Congolese music, Sudanese music, Moroccan and Libyan music, and so much more, and brought attention to a region, a sound, a culture that was often overlooked or forgotten. What I love about this label is that it just shows how quality music is timeless and can reach a new, wider audience. For instance, how one track pre-HABIBI FUNK might have had 500 listens on Spotify and past HABIBI FUNK reached more than 10 million, which, by the way, the money goes straight to the artist. The key for the label is to make sure that the how they discover the music doesn't overshadow the actual artist. It's not just music, but cultural context, which of course is very much in line of what we're doing here at Are We On Air. The full playlist of HABIBI FUNK is available on our Are We On Air Spotify and Apple channels. On that note, Yalla Habibis, let's go discover some great music together. Welcome to Are We On Air, JANNIS STÜRTZ, aka HABIBI FUNK.
Thanks for having me.
We're here at the beautiful Chateau Royal in Berlin, and we're having a little coffee. And I'm very excited to chat with you because I love your label, HABIBI FUNK. Obsessed.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. When we started it, I don't think we would have anticipated having podcast talks about it, but it turned out to be more of a longevity project than we initially thought it would be, but that's great.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta tell me, how did it all start? I mean, you're in Berlin. Are you from Berlin?
No, I'm actually from Cologne.
Oh, really? No way.
Yeah. I don't think you've lived there in a very, very long time.
I left
right?
when I was like 17, something like that. Yeah.
But yeah, maybe Groove Attack Records was
Of course, yeah.
So
I was a compact person.
All right, but fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
But Groove Attack is kind of like a founding moment for me getting into music. HABIBI FUNK particularly started because even before HABIBI FUNK, I was co-running a label called Jakarta Records, and one of the artists from that label, called Blitz the Ambassador, he used to be a musician. Now he's like a script writer and author, but he played a festival in Morocco called Mawazine, and I joined him on that trip, stayed a couple of days extra, and then like whenever I travel, I'm usually not that interested in like the classic touristy bits. I just like walking the streets. And even back then, I was always interested when I would travel to pick up some records from that place, from like the 70s.
Just the regular like stuff I picked up.
Yeah. I walked like a side street in Casablanca and I came across a shop that clearly was in the business of like repairing broken electronics. But I looked inside, and behind stacks and stacks of broken electronics was stacks and stacks of records.
Oh.
And it turned out that the guy used to have a distribution and a record label in the 70s. When business died down in the 90s, he kind of switched. I asked him about the record. I think he perceived it as really weird, kind of kicked me out of the shop. That was it. But then the next day, there was an old gentleman walking along the Medina trying to give tours to tourists. He must have been in his late 80s, very, very old Moroccan gentleman. And he asked me whether I wanted to have a tour. And I was like, no, but maybe come along and tried to build a
Negotiate.
friendship with this shop owner with me. And that actually helped. He explained a bit better than me why I was interested in records. And then he let me look through the shop, and I picked up like a big stack of records. And there was one that had like a guy with wild hair, one tooth missing, but like a bright smile. And he credited James Brown on the flip side in the writing credits. This was a 7-inch by Fadul, which turned out to be our first release. And basically, I loved the record. It was like a adaptation of Papa Got a Brand New Bag, but with the lyrics flipped into a song where he deals with trying to not drink the next day, and musically played in a very, like, without that genre having existed at the time, but a very punk rock aesthetic. You could clearly tell it was more about the energy in the room when they recorded, as opposed to having a perfect sound, a perfectly rehearsed take, and any of that. I guess because we were already running a record label and we knew how it works technically, how the distribution works, how manufacturing works, the idea was born to try to find the guy and re-release his music. And then we tried to find him for 2 years. After a year, we met another band from Morocco from the same time, and they told us that he had passed away in the early 1990s already. But they remembered a guy called Tony Day. Tony Day is not his actual name, but Tony Day used to be the background singer for a lot of these bands and the dancer on stage. And Tony Day now lives in Nuremberg as a security guard.
Oh, wow.
And we called Tony, and Tony was like, yeah, Fadul has been dead for a long time. We used to be good friends. But go to this particular neighborhood of Casablanca. This is where his family used to live 20 years ago. So we went to like the old coffee places and asked like the old gentlemen, like playing cards, have you ever seen this guy? And showed them like a cover of one of the 7 inches. Eventually someone remembered where his family used to live. His parents had passed away in the meantime, but one of the neighbors used to knew where the brother lived. So we kind of cold called the brother's home. His brother's daughter opened the door, and she was like, yeah, this guy looks like my dad, but I know it's not my dad. So she knew she had an uncle who had passed away before she was born, but she didn't even know he was a musician. Her dad was I think in the mosque, but Fadul's sister, so her aunt lived next door, so they called her. They were very surprised for someone to come looking for their brother, especially then, and for their brother's music. But they loved the idea, so we eventually licensed the music from them, and that was the starting point. And then we kind of kept on doing research, trying to find other music. So HABIBI FUNK as a record label, what we're always trying to make clear is that what we're doing tries not to represent quote-unquote Arab music of a certain era. What we re-release is largely overlooked special interest music that would be, if you would say you're searching for equivalent for that music in Germany, it would be probably a band like Can or whatever. It is not, like, whatever we re-release does not necessarily represent mainstream music, but it represents what was like
it went into obscurity, like in a dusted bin somewhere behind some electronics in Casablanca.
Yes, and it tends to be the music where influences from different places came together and became something new. Often you have the influences of like Afro-American music, soul, funk, jazz. But if you look at the Sudanese music we re-released, Congolese music or Ethiopian music are as influential, or we are working on a lot of music from...
So you're going further south now, actually?
Not consciously.
Yeah.
But
you're following the sound, really?
Yeah, whatever. So currently we're doing a lot of like research into like Libyan music.
Oh, wow.
And for example, one of the most influential genres in Libya for the last 30 years has been reggae. Like reggae is huge to this day in Libya. But yeah, whenever like musicians kind of created a localized translation of an influence from abroad, brought it together with something they already knew, there's a high chance that this led to something that might be something that could become a release under Habibi Funk.
Wow, I love that. I love a good dig and how to start. But before we even go into Habibi Funk, why don't we start where you started with what's your earliest significant musical memory that shaped you as an artist?
I mean, I wouldn't call myself an artist. I'm just even though I DJ a bit, but even like the type of DJing I do is more the selector type of DJing. So
which we love.
No, there's nothing wrong with
Yeah.
it, especially because I don't play electronic music. But therefore, I think there's DJs who don't produce who rightfully can claim that they're artists because they have mastered DJing on a technical scale that it rightfully has the tag of being an artist. I don't DJ like that, so I would never call myself an artist. Having said that, I still remember when I was like, how old was I? I have no clue. But I used to, like, on Saturdays, there was on German radio, but I don't even remember which station it was. Probably 1 Live. But
1
what was it?
Live.
WDR 1 was it before that? And they would have the charts. So I would always sit next to the radio and tape my favorite songs. I must have been like 7 or 8. But I think we briefly mentioned it, realizing we come from the same town. I think like the defining moment, and that might not be the earliest musical memory, but the defining musical memory is when I was 15 in Germany. When you're in 10th grade, you have to make a school internship, which internship is a misleading term. I think it's 2 weeks. You're kind of just being... for 2 weeks being a
Getting
burden for a company who gets nothing from you but has this 15-year-old running around. So I did this at Groovetech, which was the local record shop. And back then Groovetech was big. They're still a distributor, but back then they were also a record label. And I think they did like the first Jay Dilla record and all of that. I did this school internship there. And yeah, I guess I was 15. And somehow they liked me. So they offered me to stay on to work there once a week on Saturdays. So for the last 4 years of me being to school, I had this like the coolest imaginable side job, a student job. And back then at Groovetech, everyone was either a DJ, ran a small label, did something music related. Before that, I literally had bought my first vinyl record at Groovetech maybe 3 weeks before that. And I only asked whether I can do my internship there because I was running late for getting something more serious. So before that, I was not, I mean, I listened to music, but I was not part of
Wasn't a conscious
something.
decision. in that
Yeah,
sense,
and I was not, there was no context for me. It was just me liking music, how everyone likes music. But I think that therefore, like being that student employee of Groovetech kind of was maybe not my earliest memory, but is the defining memory because it put me in a room with people who kind of one way or another were doing what I would, once I graduated school, would be doing by starting Jakarta Records, out of which Habibi Funk was birthed. So yeah, I think that is kind of a defining one.
And what 3 tracks would you choose that define Habibi Funk? Which were the significant 3 records for you?
I think the first and foremost is Fadul Sidredat, because that was the one track that I've randomly found in this shop in Casablanca. So when it comes to the most defining song being this, the second and third position is like there's a huge gap in between. So I mean, this is like
the one.
This is the one in terms of Habibi Funk becoming a project.
وسيد الرداد شو من حل احباب وسيد الجواد شو من حل انشاد ومول الباس راني مشتاق الكاف.
And then the second one is Ayuna, which has this position because I think when I DJ, it's always a mix in between our own releases, but a lot of our own releases are not DJ material. You don't get people to dance to that because it's too slow, too melancholic, whatever. But Ayuna became this one song, and it has like 10 million streams on Spotify, and it was used in this advertisement, and it pops up here and there. That probably from the music we re-released ourselves became the closest of being a quote-unquote hit. And I'm still using hit as a relative term within the small niche scene. But I think the track also shows what we are luckily, based upon the network and the community we build, we are able to do for a song if things align well. I think Ayuna was on Spotify for 10 years and gathered 5,000 plays. And then we took over, and within 4 years, we brought it to 10 million. And I think that is kind of also explains quite well of what we ideally do. We like, as a record label, we are an amplifier for music that we think should have more listeners. We're trying to build a bridge between this song and this artist and connect the work and the artist with a bigger audience. Global audience still sounds too big, but yeah.
No, come on, it's a global audience.
Small audiences all over the globe.
Yeah.
And then I guess the third song would be any song from Ahmed Malek, who was an Algerian film composer.
I love Ahmed Malek.
Yeah, like his music is beautiful. We have like he sadly already passed away before we did the project, but we have like a very close relationship to his daughters. We also did an exhibition about his work in Algeria in the Museum of Modern Art there. So basically we came across his music, we wanted to reissue it. We did a little bit of digging and realized we had no immediate idea of how to find his family. And then I had a DJ gig in Beirut, and I spoke to a friend of mine, and I told her about the music. She knew the artist as well. And I was like, yeah, well, I knew some people in France also had tried to reissue the music, but they also didn't have any luck in locating the family. So she was like, yeah, I have this one friend in Algeria. Let me ask her. Maybe she has an idea. And I was like, yeah, do that. But I mean, there's like 60 million people in Algeria. Don't quote me. Might be more, might be less. But enough people to not make that seem like a realistic opportunity. And then like 2 weeks later, she calls me, Jannis, you won't believe it, but my friend's family live in the same building on the same floor as Ahmed Malek's daughter. So even though I'm not like a religious person, but like when Hinya told me, no, my dad made it happen from heaven, that was meant to be, I was like, yeah, can't argue with that. I mean, the odds of this project working out the way it worked out. And then also when her father passed away 10 years ago, her father was already good in keeping things. And then she kind of put it all in this big drawer and never opened it again. But hence there was this, and that was also the reason why, apart from re-releasing his music, we were also able to do this exhibition that kind of, because all of his music was film soundtracks. So
and actually were used in films.
Yeah, he was like the go-to guy for post-colonial Algerian cinema in the 70s.
Yeah. That's why it's so beautiful.
So a lot of people in Algeria don't know his name, but they know the melodies because a lot of it is very iconic movies. But yeah, so there was a lot of like archival material that also allowed us to create this exhibition. Like, for example, there's this photo. He represented Algeria a lot. So for example, at the World Exhibitions at the like Algerian Pavilion, he used to play with his band. So there's this photo of him playing with his band. But then there's in the same next to it, she still kept the original shirt he's wearing in that photo. Cool. So things like this.
Yeah.
damn, I wanted to, maybe we still make that happen before you leave, but I wanted to bring you some of the physical records. But because for us, like, it's the work of contextualizing the music is always very crucial. And this is why we've done exhibitions, we've done short documentaries, but also all of the reissues we do always come with like booklets where
The story, really.
yeah, we write down the story, the biography, try to contextualize the music. And that ends up being a big part of the workload. Oftentimes finding the artist and licensing the music is much quicker done than trying to find photos, trying to find information, especially for artists that have passed away already.
Wow. I mean, it must be so gratifying and fulfilling to when you have those experiences with the families and like even within the culture, within the society of wherever you go and find this and really manage to put a spotlight onto those people and to their culture and sound and bring it to a global audience, which you do also within the story, within the context. I mean, that must be a great feeling. I mean, business aside, this is just you're doing important work here.
I mean, thank you, but I was always a person buying these type of re-releases as well. And on the one hand, I don't want to make what we do sound more important and more serious than it is. We're not an archival record label. Yeah. We are a record label that does archival work, but it's only small pinpoints. Yeah. But in the end, it's always this balancing act of also not making the story of how we come to the music or the quote-unquote brand of the record label too big so it overshadows the original artist. Because in the end, when you try to compare the relevance of us versus the artist of the music, our name should be somewhere in the back, somewhere in the fine print. Obviously, on a personal level, yeah, when you are part, like we've had artists that told us I would have never thought that I would actually ever get paid for my music. Where you meet artists that have normalized the fact that they do music without getting an economic compensation for it, and us being able to change that for some artists when they're already like in their late 70s is obviously something that feels good for everyone involved. In the end, our motivation is because we come across music we genuinely like and we want to have more people hear it. Therefore, the motivation between Jakarta Records, which is the other label, which is like a contemporary label, and HABIBI FUNK is not really different. All of the things you mentioned, the things I mentioned regarding archiving, they are great, but essentially they are byproduct. They are byproducts of great music and us feeling more people need to hear this great music. In the end, that is the focus. And obviously running a record label is sometimes one of these jobs that from the outside to a lot of people looks and must appear more sexy than it actually is, because it's also writing a lot of emails and like a lot of dry work, but obviously at the same time it's gratifying work in general, I guess, in comparison to a lot of 9-to-5s.
Funny, because I had the similar situation when I was in Beirut a couple of years ago. Of course, I went digging, and I love how HABIBI FUNK within the Orient as well became. They know, like, people are coming now to our region, music heads, to specifically go and hopefully finding these dustbin moments, right? And they were like, I don't know, eye rolling when I was like, okay, you're another one, you know?
Yes, true. But then again, you also probably tapped in to the exact same microcosm bubble that I'm also like, yeah. I probably know the places.
100%.
When you come from this world of record collecting, quote unquote digging, it's a very male dominated world, and it's a world very dominated by secrecy. But yeah, I found this one record that nobody knows and all of that.
I had that Zohra record before you released that. I had a 7-inch.
I'm sure, but what I'm always not a fan of is this like
competitiveness.
This competitiveness.
Yeah. I'm not like this at all. I don't care. No, I share everything. I think that's the beauty, because we are in the end of the day just curators. We didn't even produce that artwork, right? Or if you DJ, you're just playing someone else's artwork anyway. So it's like, who am I to say, no, you can't have this because it's only a record of 3 edition or something like that.
And that is the same thing for me for like these record shops. I think I tend to have a good relationship with all of the record shops in MENA because I tend to post about them on social medias quite frequently because
does that make it more difficult for you to find stuff now? Because more stuff is gone now because people know.
Definitely. But it's like these record shops are part of the network that allow record labels like ours to do their work. Because this is the places where something interesting might show up. This is the place that keeps vinyl culture alive. So I think, and when I kind of have to balance my interests in between keeping stuff secret, so I find all of the great records as opposed to trying to help to
nurture the culture.
And also have them have more customers, so it's economically viable to still run these places. I think me trying to support within our limited means these businesses is always more important than keeping stuff secret, because I feel like these record shops are part of the networks just like record labels are. And therefore I feel like, it's very important to share these addresses, to tell people like you find records in Beirut there, there and there.
So on that note, give us maybe the top 3 or top 5 of record stores in Morocco, in Lebanon, for listeners if they want to go dig.
I'm getting into trouble if I forget anyone. Cairo is a great place. There is a small shopping mall in Zamalek near the Kulthum statue. And in this shopping mall, there's Sherry's and there's there's 4 record shops for secondhand vinyl in this mall. And then around the corner is Retrograde, which is another place that has records. So literally the 4 or 5 key shops for Cairo and probably Egypt are in a vicinity of 200 meters. Makes it very convenient. And they also, most of them still get new stock frequently. So it's always good going there. Then in Beirut, Chico is the institution, Diran, who runs the shop. His father used to run a record label called Zida Records together with Ziad Rahmani, which released a lot of very iconic, absurdly hard to find releases in the late 70s and early 80s. And then there is the Weekend Market that has 2 sellers. And then Naji, who's a lovely guy. I don't know whether his shop is still open at this point, but he also sells on the Weekend Market on Armenia Road. In Morocco, there's People's Choice, which is more like in Casablanca, which is more like new records. Last time I checked, a lot of the old shops in Casablanca closed because the owners died and nobody took them over. There was Disgam, there was Comptoir General. I think they're both closed now. There's a shop in Agadir, Zaman Records, I think is.
So more in Casablanca than, let's say, Tangier or Marrakesh?
Yes, because I think Casablanca used to be the center of music business. So this is then hence also where
Casablanca Records.
Yeah. So for example, yes,
is that the reason why?
For example, this gum, it was a record shop, but it was the flagship store of a record label. So this is, I think, a lot of times how record shops were also birthed, that they were just the shops that were an extension of a record label at some point. But yeah, I mean, basically, if you scroll down the HABIBI FUNK Instagram, at some point you'll come across someone, older person smiling, showing a record that usually is like I post this list every 6 months, and I try to keep the list updated where you can find all of the record shops. And if you can't find it, just send me a message and I'll send a link.
On HABIBI FUNK Instagram, guys.
Yeah, but yeah, like I said, I think it's important that these places kind of survive. Obviously, each country is different.
Yeah, of course.
In a place like Lebanon, if you would ask me what are the most impressive collections of... Sometimes you have this problem, I think in West Africa that happened a lot, that so many records left to the secondhand vinyl markets in Europe, the US, Japan. There's probably, I'm not pro for West African music, but there's probably a lot of the good stuff that has left the country. But if you look, for example, at a place like Lebanon, and if you would ask me what are the 3, 4, 5 most impressive collections of Lebanese music, they're all within Lebanon. Like, you have a very strong local collectors society. The majority of the very like in demand, hard to find collectors items records
Are still there.
get bought and sold within the Lebanese market.
So you're able to tap into that, or they're like,
Yeah, for example, like the Onya record we released. At this point, I didn't have a copy of it. So it was Diran from Chico Records who allowed us to digitize his copy. Again, it's all about a network. So
and
sometimes
it's a community really that you guys also built and tapped into, right?
Yes, and I think there's a lot of things that, and I think I'm particularly, because as someone coming from outside, as someone coming from Germany, being able to be part of these like small communities is something that feels especially important to me, because I was very much welcomed. So I always want to make sure it's like a two-way street. It's not only like I'm taking something, but I'm also always trying to like return these favors, because I think, and that is I guess also what is kind of particular about the label, that even though at this point the team is much bigger, we have like a colleague in Cairo, and like we have like a lot of people working with us on individual projects. We have someone who works with us, for example, on the Libyan projects right now in Libya, because Libya is one of the places I can't go to. But I think as a label that is based in Germany, there is a lot of labels re-releasing music from outside of Europe.
Awesome
but I think,
Tapes of Africa.
yes. Now all of the Analog Africa, I love. I think what it often happens that predominantly for the quote unquote Western market, and for one reason or another, we managed to re-release the music in a way that it also resonates with the people
In the
where
countries,
like the music is coming from. Like you have people, like I've had these conversations often with like, I didn't know that in my parents' or parents' generation there was this music in my hometown. And I think that is something that is very important for us. And I think that is kind of also part why it feels important to be part of these local networks, because they also kind of, this way you make sure your record is also available in Beirut. Even though economically, if I would look at it strictly economically, trying to make sure that our records are available in Cairo is so much effort, because I physically have to bring them there, because if I ship them, they get stuck at customs, nobody is winning. So it's so much effort and elbow grease to, let's say, make sure our releases are available in Cairo. But for me, it's important to make that effort, because to me, it feels important that the Hamid release that was recorded there is also available to be bought there.
Because they also have a big audience within the countries themselves, which is the beauty of the whole thing. I mean, as you said, they're rediscovering their own roots, because that's stuff that fell into obscurity the way it is obscure for us. It was same for them, people now of our generation, right? Like they have to have someone to curate it.
And I think that is a good point. And I think sometimes people underestimate, like especially when they can't really place the music. And I've talked about it before, but when they can't really place the music we release within the bigger picture of music from the quote unquote Arab world. But yeah, I think the equivalent is you and I getting into like obscure crowd rock bands or like early ambient 80s electronic that we never knew of.
Yeah.
But that was done in some obscure studio in Bielefeld.
Which happened.
But no.
On a more...
And we might also learn about it through a Japanese ratio
Exactly.
of that. So,
Exactly.
but yeah.
But on a more personal level, so I'm Persian German. My parents are from Iran. And that's something I had a conversation with my parents about this as well. In the Arab-speaking countries, there's so much to discover within, let's say, the sound genres of like funk, R&B, disco of that period, because that's a period that speaks to me. In the Turkish world as well. I mean, you had there's all these re-releases, all like the Zeldas and so forth, Ersen that came through, which I discovered through a record store in the early 2000s in Williamsburg, in Brooklyn, for instance, exactly to that point. someone who dig deep and found this, and they did this re-release. And I'm just curious, because there is, of course, great Persian music and Persian pop music also from that period, and Gugush and so forth. But why is there such a big difference when I hear all the great stuff that you find in the Arab-speaking country? Why is there such a disconnect in a way to Iran? I know obviously politics plays a role, but this is still during the Shah days, when Iran was very open to the West and there was a lot of influences. So personal curiosity. Why is that?
You're probably more qualified to talk about the Iranian aspect of things.
Have you been to Iran? Have you been digging or looking into Persian?
No, not really. But the Islamic Revolution is probably. That was.
But it was 79, so most of the stuff
but
you
it
find
was like a lot of the stuff like we really was recorded like late 70s, early 80s. So I think Islamic Revolution, political turmoil, then all of the majority of the musicians went to LA, but they probably needed a few years to adapt, and then the whole like disco funk thing
90s,
was over.
And then 90s started,
But that is me talking and just applying like general dates and musical genres at the time. I wouldn't even say that the influence of soul, funk, disco, and all of these genres we probably both like in the MENA region has been bigger. I think these genres were a global influence at the time. I would assume there is no place or no country on the world that doesn't have a band in the 70s that was heavily influenced by James Brown. And there's probably not a country in the world that doesn't have a band that wasn't influenced by Bob Marley. Like I think in some countries, it was on the shoulders of a handful of bands that then like moved into obscurity or moved towards a new sound, and it never became a thing and caught on. And then I think you have like the Libyan example where reggae is still a big thing to this day. It started with Bob Marley, and as opposed to fizzling out, how it might have happened in the late 70s, early 80s in other countries, it became its own genre. The same way how probably disco became more dominant in certain scenes, cities, countries, as opposed to others. But I wouldn't say that the influence of Afro-American music in the Arab-speaking world has been particularly bigger than, let's say, in West Africa. But it definitely has left its mark. And I think this is for me, has always been the takeaway that no matter where you look, you can see that this influence of particularly Afro-American music and cultural production has been global.
Absolutely, Obviously huge in West Africa, that period is incredible.
Productions out there. But like I said, especially when you look at Habibi Funk, you can also see that it's a very defining influence, and I guess the label with having funk in it kind of gives that away. But like I said, when you listen to we've done 3 releases of Sudanese jazz, and Sudanese jazz is a genre that the musicians came up with themselves, which explains why it doesn't sound like jazz music, how jazz is perceived
in the West,
outside of Sudan. But for the Sudanese musicians of that scene, you can see how they also utilized influences coming from Congolese music, coming from Ethiopian music, the same way of how they had the influences of Afro-American music. So I think the Habibi Funk is basically, we're not trying to write the history of the influence of soul, funk, jazz, disco in the Arab world. It's a bit wider than that, even though I would also agree that it has been a very central influence to the musicians whose music we've re-released.
Which Sudanese track shall we play?
Kamal Kela, Muslims and Christians. Kamal Kela is one of the Sudanese musicians we've re-released, and he was kind of the first ones to made it fashionable for the for the singer to like all out dance on stage, which was something that he took from the James Brown influence again, but was something that was not common in the live performance in Sudan. He mostly would sing in Arabic, but whenever his subjects would become a bit more political, he would switch into English. Muslims and Christians it's kind of a call for the different religions in Sudan to get along. And like the idea of unity within Sudan was always something that was very close to his heart. Sadly, he passed away 2 years ago. But and his music is also, you also hear this very clear influence of Ethiopian jazz, which
huge
actually
in itself.
Huge in itself. But there's this like little episode when we visited Habil, who's another Sudanese musician whose work we reissued. He still had 4 vinyl records. 2 were his own, and 2 were 7 inches by Mulatu Astadge that were signed to him because they sometimes performed together, which I guess gives you like his tiny record collection gives you a good idea of the connection between Ethiopian music and Sudanese music.
Oh, beautiful.
And everybody sing, we are one nation. Sudan is one nation. We are one nation. Sudan is one nation.
Well, maybe we should then start digging together and create an Iranian compilation.
Funny enough, I had a conversation there's one company in LA that, an Iranian company started by an Iranian who came to LA after the revolution. And they produced most of the music in LA, but they also bought the old catalog. So they literally own 90% of the Iranian recorded music. And we had like a very early stages conversation about maybe doing some project together, but
I'd love to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'll loop you in. He's in LA, so you should meet him anyway.
Yeah. Well, to go back to a couple of tracks, what's your go-to falling in love or heartbreak song?
I think we had this conversation before we started. Like all of these, like when you do interviews, there's a lot of these questions of songs, especially when you do interviews for radio, I guess, because it's the perfect introduction to songs. Whenever it comes to these things of tying into like a particular emotion, I never have an answer to this. I think
first thing that comes to your mind. It's like you'll be in front of your record shelf and you just pull a record out.
The problem, I think, is when you deal with music so much, and I think that's what I told you before, that you rarely have songs that stick for any of these things. Like you kind of do the deep dive into this particular sound, this particular artist, and then for a month you only listen to this artist, and then you don't listen to this artist again for like 5 years.
But if you
so I get the question, and I'm trying to come up with like, I mean, I saw this question before. I guess I listened to too few love songs.
Well, you did mention a lot of the tracks on Habibi Funk are not just like party; they're actually more melancholic to a certain extent, and I agree, which is beautiful. Maybe not in a party environment, but in this environment it would work.
And this is, I think, a second. I listen to a lot of music, not caring or listening or even understanding lyrics. Like I also listen to a lot of like Brazilian music, a lot of Ethiopian music. Even like when I was like the music I was largely socialized in is like hip hop. And I think when I started listening to hip hop a lot when I was like 15 or 16, I didn't understand a lot of the lyrics because my English wasn't that good, and then it was slang. And then sometimes I listen to these songs again now when my English is somewhat okay. I was like, that's fucking horrible lyrics.
Do you have that sometimes with the like? Do you translate the lyrics of the stuff?
I mean, for the stuff we re-release.
I know
you
have to, right?
Yeah. And then, I mean, sometimes it feels like you realize it's very plain and simple songwriting. There's nothing too deep about it. And then sometimes you're like, oh, it's actually okay that I got to liking the song without the lyrics. But then, like if you have Onia, they're like one of the last albums we released, which is all based on poetry. Like the band was like all leftist Lebanese. So they made an album heavily influenced by Brazilian music. They listened to a lot of like Antonio Carlos Jobim and like a lot of Brazilian bossa jazz. And then they made an album being influenced by this music, but also from their political perspective, they chose Palestinian poets and took their poetry, like Mahmoud Darwish, and obviously the lyrical content is very crucial and meaningful, and even though you can get it translated, but there's this like it goes over your head. But at the same time, I think oftentimes when music does a good job, you kind of already pick up on a certain emotion without understanding the lyrics. Or once you understand the lyrics, it only like re-emphasizes what you already had as a takeaway from the song emotionally, because it is already in
it's
there.
It's a visceral
musically.
experience,
Yeah, and I think for this album, that's a good example for that.
في الشوارع النائمة يوقظ في الشوارع النائمة سجناء المدينة.
I think the very powerful love songs, I always liked Terry Callier's What Color Is Love album, I think I bought it. That was Groove Tech times. That was probably one of the first records before Groove Tech. I think the first record I bought was Mos Def and Talib Kweli. And then 2 weeks later, I started working there. And then I think I went through this phase of a lot of hip-hop people trying to understand the music that was sampled in order to create a hip-hop beat. So I became more open to soul, funk, jazz. And like Terry Callier's album was one of the first like deep
samples that you discovered.
Yeah, I don't even think that one has a lot of samples in it. But it somehow, my colleagues were always playing it. I followed their recommendation. And even though I don't really associate it with a particular heartbreak, but I think it deals with like love
that subject matter,
and pain and all of like related to that. And I think it goes very deep into these emotions. So I think that is probably a good song to pick, even though, again, an album I haven't listened to in a long time. But I think whenever I revisit it, I still really, really like it. I think it's whatever it qualifies as a timeless classic.
Color is love. Is it near or is it far? Is it distant like a star? What color is love?
Also a lot of like the slower stuff of Stevie Wonder. I love Stevie Wonder. And Stevie Wonder is one of these artists. So I think sometimes you have artists where you're like, I like their slow songs, I like their upbeat songs. But Stevie Wonder, I think, is one of these complete artists where whatever he did, maybe I don't need Happy Birthday to You, but 95% of what he did, even like from like the late 60s to the late 80s, like he has very few misses.
Absolutely. Well, to wrap up our little chat, for the Netflix documentary about Habibi Funk, what song is going to be played in the end credits?
Funny enough, I had and I'm sorry if the person is listening, but I had this experience of being part of a documentary that was not dealing with Habibi Funk, it was more dealing with the subject matter where we were a side note. Kind of realized that the whole thing of like moving around was like, because there's a lot of filmmakers that reach out, want to do this story. I've learned that I'm not that comfortable with. I'm comfortable with one-on-one interviews. That's fine, but with the whole idea of cameras moving you around while you visit artists, while you go to a record shop, kind of takes the natural out of the interaction. So I'm not entirely sure whether this Habibi Funk documentary will come to light. Around the same time, I also had like a local Egyptian team do a small documentary thing, and they only recorded it on cell phones without artificial lights.
Which, by the way, Sahel Sounds, I love. They have this compilation of exactly that, the cell phones. Record, because that's the way people record and trade music within the African continent to a certain extent.
Oh, yeah.
My music from a WhatsApp, right?
Yes.
So,
music from African cell phones on Sahel Sounds,
exactly.
I think is the label.
Yeah. Love.
But speaking about the documentary, so maybe that's the only thing that works for me when it. But having said that, I'm not entirely sure whether it's probably more a hypothetical soundtrack because that documentary might not come to life. I think the Ahmed Malik songs obviously would work great just because they are meant to complement a visual, and I think they just do so incredibly great in doing so. Then we're working on a project by a Lebanese musician called Cosmic Analog Ensemble, but he has like 25 artist names he produces under. He's called Sharif. He works for the UN and he plays like 20 instruments. And he has 90 albums. And he does instrumental music very much influenced by people like Ahmed Malik, by the Italian.
So contemporary, really.
Yeah. He's like our age.
Okay.
And he's going to be the first contemporary, still active musician to release on Habibi Funk next year. Also very much influenced by like Italian soundtracks of the 70s, like French soundtracks of the 60s. You hear all of this in this sound, but then you hear Ziad Rahbani in there as well. So I guess one of his songs just again works great as soundtrack
Which
music.
track?
He's still working on that album.
Okay.
So,
Right.
but I can give you
for the purpose of this, we're gonna hear this.
I'll send you something.
All right.
Commencez là-bas, dis-moi comment c'est là-bas, comme c'est là-bas, comment c'est là-bas, comment c'est. Commencez là-bas, dis-moi comment c'est là-bas, comment c'est là-bas, comment c'est. Commencez là-bas, dis-moi comment c'est là-bas, comment.
And then Issam Hajali's stuff is just very beautiful, and it's also very scenic, both with his band, the Oni album, but also his solo album, one of my favorite albums.
أنا لم أخنك فلا تخني أنا لم أبعك فلا تبعني أنا لم أخنك فلا تخني أنا لم أبعك فلا تبعني.
And that also was, by the way, was one of these full circle moments. Like, as I said, like the Black Star album was the first album I bought, and like Mos Def, who's half of Black Star, he's a huge fan of Issam's album. So he did this live stream like a few months ago where he's just dancing to Issam's album. So that was also like a personal full circle moment.
That.
This being the first guy I personally bought a record from.
All night Sunday, sun crew. Follow me now, listen. Say high tech, yes, you're rolling hip hop. Say J-roll, yes, you're rolling hip hop. Redefinition, say you're rolling hip hop. Say Black Soul, come to rock it, yo. From the first to the last of it, delivery is passionate. The whole and not the half of it. Forecasting aftermath of it. Projectile and I'm blasted with accurate assassin shit. Me a quality close like Bethlehem and Nazareth. After this, you be pressing rewind on top your mouth.
Well, Jannis, aka Habibi Funk, thank you for being on air with us. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in this week. If you want to listen to the full playlist, visit areweonair.com or our Spotify channel. You can also find us on Instagram and on YouTube at areweonair. And a big thank you to my wonderful team at Studio Neu. I'm Armand Nafei, and I'll speak to you soon.